Northern China, 1211. Genghis Khan stands before the Battle of Yehuling with 90,000 Mongol warriors, the army that will eventually conquer more territory than any force in human history. Now, imagine a single M1 Abrams tank materializes on that battlefield, and here's why this scenario is fundamentally different from any other ancient army. The Mongols didn't just fight, they innovated. They encountered Chinese gunpowder weapons, siege engines, and war elephants they'd never seen before, and within months, they'd not only countered these technologies, they'd improved them and used them better than the armies they conquered. So the real question isn't whether a tank can kill medieval warriors, it's whether the most adaptable military force in history could figure out how to kill something from 800 years in the future before it kills all of them. Let's establish what the Mongols actually were, because Hollywood has given us a completely wrong picture. These weren't wild barbarians charging mindlessly at enemies. The Mongol army at Yehuling was the most sophisticated mobile fighting force the medieval world had ever produced. They had a communication system using flags and torches that allowed coordinated maneuvers across battlefields spanning dozens of miles. They had a logistics network so efficient they could operate 2,000 miles from their home base. They had intelligence gathering systems that modern armies would recognize, using merchants and traders as spies who mapped enemy territories years before invasion. Every Mongol warrior owned multiple horses and could shoot accurately from the saddle at full gallop. But what made them truly terrifying wasn't their equipment or even their skill, it was their institutional learning. When Mongols encountered a problem, they solved it systematically, then incorporated that solution into their standard doctrine. They captured Chinese engineers and forced them to build siege equipment. They studied Islamic military manuals and integrated those tactics. They were a learning organization with a culture of ruthless pragmatism, and that changes everything about this scenario. The M1 Abrams rolling onto this battlefield represents a technological advantage that's almost incomprehensible. It weighs 70 tons and moves at 45 miles per hour, faster than a horse can gallop for any sustained distance. Its 1,200mm smoothbore cannon can fire armor-piercing rounds at 1,670 meters per second, and those rounds can penetrate 3 feet of solid steel from over 2 miles away. The tank carries 42 main gun rounds and thousands of machine gun rounds. Its composite armor, combining layers of steel, ceramics, and depleted uranium, can stop anti-tank missiles that deliver millions of joules of kinetic energy. Mongol arrows, generating maybe 100 to 150 joules at most, cannot even scratch this armor. The technological gap sits at roughly 20,000 to 1. But here's the critical difference between this scenario and fighting other ancient armies. The Mongols won't keep shooting arrows after they realize arrows don't work. They'll try something else. First contact happens at dawn, and the psychological impact would be beyond anything medieval warfare had prepared these warriors for. The tank emerges across the battlefield, and the sound alone would be terrifying. A gas turbine engine produces a high-pitched whine and roar that sounds like nothing in nature. To warriors who'd never heard anything louder than thunder or a Chinese fire lance, this would sound like a demon. The first shot from the main gun would be absolutely catastrophic. A 1,200mm high explosive round detonating in a cavalry formation would kill dozens instantly, but more importantly, it would create a blast wave and sound pressure that would cause temporary deafness and disorientation in everyone within 50 meters. Horses would panic and bolt. Even the most disciplined warriors would have no cognitive framework for processing an explosion that powerful coming from an invisible source over a mile away. The psychological effect would cascade through the army like a shock wave. But here's where Genghis Khan's genius becomes relevant. Unlike European knights who would charge blindly at anything, Mongol doctrine explicitly prioritized reconnaissance and intelligence gathering before commitment.
Khan would not order a mass assault against something he didn't understand. Historical records show that Mongols encountered Chinese siege weapons for the first time. They pulled back, observed, captured prisoners who understood the technology, and returned months later with countermeasures. At Yehuling, Khan would initially order a feigned retreat, the Mongols' signature tactic, to draw the tank forward while his commanders observed its capabilities from safe distance. They would notice everything: the speed, the range, the rate of fire, the fact that it seems to avoid close contact, most importantly, the fact that it's completely alone. The Mongols would quickly test the tank's capabilities through controlled probing attacks. They'd send small units from different directions to see if the tank could engage multiple threats simultaneously. They'd fire arrows, not expecting to penetrate, but to observe how the crew responds, where the arrows hit, whether any openings exist. Within hours, the Mongols would know several critical facts. The tank has limited ammunition. It needs space to maneuver effectively. It seems vulnerable to being surrounded despite its power, and it's fighting alone with no reinforcements. These observations would become the foundation of their strategy. Now let's talk about what makes Mongol tactical adaptation genuinely frightening. When the Mongols besieged the Khwarezmian city of Gurganj, they faced fortifications that withstood every previous nomadic army. Within months, they'd recruited Chinese and Muslim engineers, built counterweight trebuchets, siege towers, and mining operations that breached walls considered impregnable. They didn't know how to do siege warfare, so they learned. When they encountered war elephants in India and Southeast Asia, they developed specific counters: arrow volleys targeting the mahouts, fire arrows to panic the animals, and pike formations to create barriers the elephants wouldn't cross. They adapted to everything. The tank presents a problem, but it's a problem with constraints, and Mongols excelled at exploiting constraints.
Here's the scenario that would actually unfold. After the initial shock and probing attacks, Khan would call a council with his most experienced commanders. Someone would point out the obvious: the metal beast cannot be everywhere at once. It moves fast, but 90,000 warriors can surround any position. It kills from distance, but it seems to need time between kills. It never stops for rest or food, which means it must have some kind of internal supply that eventually runs out. The Mongol leadership would formulate a strategy based on these observations. First, never mass forces within range of that thunder weapon. Spread out, stay mobile, make it chase you. Second, the beast seems to avoid difficult terrain. Use the landscape, force it into valleys, marshes, anywhere that limits mobility. Third, it's fighting alone. Be patient, wait for it to exhaust its supplies. The Mongols would implement a strategy of strategic dispersal combined with patient harassment. They'd split into dozens of smaller units spread across miles of terrain, making it impossible for the tank to engage them all. Units would take turns approaching to just outside effective machine gun range, firing arrows, not to damage, but to force the tank to respond, to burn ammunition, to waste fuel maneuvering. This is exactly how Mongol forces defeated larger European armies. They refused to fight on the enemy's terms. They'd retreat for days, weeks even, wearing down pursuers until the moment was right to strike. Against the tank, they'd do the same in reverse. The tank crew would face an impossible dilemma. They have perhaps 8 hours of fuel for active combat operations. They have 42 main gun rounds and maybe 10,000 machine gun rounds. Against 90,000 enemies who refuse to cluster together, who stay just beyond effective range, who attack from multiple directions simultaneously, ammunition becomes critical immediately. The canister rounds that would be devastating against massed formations are less effective against dispersed units. The crew would need to make agonizing choices. Do you shoot at that group of 20 horsemen 800 meters away, or conserve ammunition for bigger threats? Every shot fired is one shot closer to becoming defenseless. Now here's where Mongol engineering capability becomes crucial.
And this is what differentiates them from other medieval armies. The Mongols didn't just adapt tactics, they adapted technology. Within days of observing the tank, they'd start experimenting with countermeasures. They had access to Chinese incendiary weapons, proto-gunpowder mixtures that created intense heat. They could build large-scale versions of these weapons, essentially giant firepots, and position them in terrain where the tank must pass. They understood siege engineering, which means they understood how to modify terrain. They could dig concealed pits, build obstacles, create killing zones where the tank's mobility becomes liability rather than asset. Give the Mongols a week, and they'd have working prototypes of anti-tank obstacles designed by captured Chinese engineers who'd never seen a tank but understood the principles of trapping mobile siege equipment. The most dangerous phase would come when the Mongols shift from reaction to proactive hunting. They'd identify the tank's operational patterns. When does it need to slow down? What terrain does it avoid? How long can it maintain continuous combat before pausing? Then they'd create situations that exploit those patterns. They'd use fire to create smoke that obscures thermal imaging, something they'd learned from Chinese warfare. They'd use the landscape, forcing the tank into terrain where tracks could fail, into river crossings where it might bog down, into narrow valleys where maneuver space disappears. The moment the tank becomes immobile, even temporarily, the scenario shifts completely.
Imagine the tank throwing a track in rough terrain or getting stuck in a marsh. It happens to modern tanks in combat conditions, even with experienced crews. The moment those treads stop moving, 90,000 warriors can converge on one position. The Mongols would approach using terrain for cover, moving in darkness, creating smoke and dust to obscure targeting. They'd bring rope, chains, whatever materials they could use to further immobilize it. They'd build fires underneath to create heat that makes the interior uninhabitable. They'd simply surround it completely and wait. The crew has food and water for perhaps 48 hours. After that, they're fighting dehydration and exhaustion. Meanwhile, the Mongols can rotate fresh warriors indefinitely. But let's assume the tank maintains perfect mobility and the crew makes no mistakes. Could it actually kill 90,000 warriors before running out of ammunition and fuel? The math is brutal. With 42 main gun rounds, optimistically causing 30 to 50 casualties each through careful targeting of clustered groups, that's maybe 1,500 to 2,000 casualties. Machine guns with 10,000 rounds, achieving perhaps 1 casualty per 10 rounds against dispersed targets, adds another 1,000 casualties. That's 3,000 casualties maximum, roughly 3% of the Mongol force. Historically, medieval armies often broke when they suffered 20 to 30% casualties. But the Mongols weren't normal medieval armies. They'd fought battles where they lost half their forces and continued fighting. They had a level of discipline and commitment that's hard for modern people to comprehend. The timeline becomes everything. Hour 1, psychological shock, probing attacks, Mongol forces scatter and observe. Hours 2 through 4, the tank inflicts heavy casualties on any forces that cluster, but ammunition depletes steadily. Hours 5 through 8, fuel becomes critical. The tank must choose between mobility and engagement. By hour 8, even with perfect efficiency, the tank is running on fumes with minimal ammunition. The Mongols, meanwhile, have learned its patterns, identified its constraints, and begun implementing countermeasures. Days 2 through 7, assuming the tank somehow refueled, which is impossible in 1211, the Mongols would be implementing siege tactics, terrain modification, and coordinated harassment that forces constant fuel consumption. By week 2, even in the most optimistic scenario, the tank is combat ineffective. Here's what makes this scenario genuinely fascinating. Both sides represent peak capabilities within their respective eras. The M1 Abrams is arguably the finest main battle tank ever built, and the Mongol army under Genghis Khan was the most effective military organization of the medieval period. In a single afternoon battle on open terrain, the tank wins absolutely. Ancient weapons cannot penetrate modern armor, and the psychological impact would be devastating. But warfare isn't about single afternoons,
especially not for the Mongols, who regularly conducted campaigns lasting years across continents. The Mongols' superpower wasn't their bows or their horses. It was their ability to learn, adapt, and implement new strategies faster than any other force in history. There's a reason the Mongol Empire conquered more territory than Rome, more than Alexander, more than anyone before or since. It wasn't because they were stronger or better equipped than their enemies. They usually weren't. It was because they never fought the same battle twice. They observed, adapted, and innovated continuously. Against the tank, they'd do exactly what they did against every other superior technology they encountered. They'd figure out its limitations, exploit its constraints, and wait for the moment those constraints became vulnerabilities. The tank is a masterpiece of modern engineering, but it's designed to operate as a combined arms force with infantry support, air cover, supply lines, and maintenance capabilities. Alone, it's incredibly powerful, but fundamentally limited. The Mongols, by contrast, were designed to operate independently for months in hostile territory, with no supply lines beyond what they could forage or capture. The verdict isn't about whether technology beats medieval warfare. Obviously it does. The verdict is about whether a finite amount of technology can defeat an adaptive opponent with effectively infinite patience and numbers. If the tank crew had unlimited ammunition, unlimited fuel, and no crew fatigue, they'd win eventually through sheer attrition. But they don't have unlimited anything. They have 42 rounds, 8 hours of fuel, and 4 human beings who need sleep, water, and will make mistakes under stress. The Mongols have 90,000 warriors, centuries of institutional knowledge about defeating superior opponents, and a commander who never lost a campaign in his entire life. Over days or weeks, the Mongols would find a way, not because they're better warriors, but because they're better adapters. That's why we remember Genghis Khan 800 years later, and that's why this scenario is far more complex than it first appears.